With those taken care of, at this time, I'd like to welcome our speaker this afternoon, Rod Simmons. Rod is a plant ecologist who has worked extensively in the fields of natural resource management and ecological restoration for over 25 years. He is a member of the Virginia Botanical Associates and works closely with the Virginia and Maryland Natural Heritage Programs. He's a member and a past president of the Botanical Society of Washington, a past president of the Maryland Native Plant Society, and serves on the boards of the Maryland and Virginia Native Plant Societies. He is also a regular field trip leader for all of those organizations. Rod is the Natural Resource Manager and Plant Ecologist for the city of Alexandria, Virginia. Welcome, Rod.
Thank you. Great to be here. Thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. It's great to be part of this very successful conference. The title of this presentation, Successfully Tackling Non-Native Invasive Plants with Public Support. This is really from a large scale infestation perspective, and the importance of getting public support and proper funding to successfully achieve this much needed control on a large landscape scale. That said, please feel free to have questions on specific methodologies or best practices for removal of specific plants, non-native invasive plants, or different kinds of successes and challenges in working with those. So by all means, you can feel free to ask those questions as well at the end when we do the question and answer period. A lot of folks, this first slide here, a lot of folks have seen this familiar sight, probably of the Japanese stiltgrass invasion. This is a woodland in Montgomery County, Maryland, part of Great Falls National Park there at the Maryland side. And this is just a complete carpeting of the forest floor of highly invasive Japanese stiltgrass. Just in this example alone here, there was 20 years ago, there was there's almost no stiltgrass in this forest, but community, as in lots of places around the state of Virginia and the mid-Atlantic. But in 2 or 3 decades, it's really taken off, and now it just forms these dead zones over a large scale. And now we have another highly invasive grass, the wavy leaf basket grass, which is very similar, but it's harder to eradicate. So it's just an example of the large scale challenges and infestations that we're dealing with here, where large tracts of land are just lost. They become ecological dead zones, and biodiversity, the native biodiversity, just plummets to where you get to just a small number of species, owing to the infestations. Next frame, please. We all know the presence of non-native invasive plants is a result of soil and habitat disturbance. That can be in any way of small to large. I mean, it could be the picture at the right is a stream construction project where, replacing a sanitary sewer line there over the years, and all the digging and earth moving and regrading. Some invasives really opportunistically exploit these conditions. Stiltgrass, of course, we just saw is certainly one of them. Wavy leaf basket grass, but lots of other multiflora rose, bush honeysuckle. There's just a long list of the usually the same species that really take advantage of these situations, and once they're they're in the seed bank and they're pervasive and they're very difficult to control or remove. Some because of their tenacity in the soils and the fact that they resist herbicides, and others because they produce large amounts of seed and remain in the seed bank, and very difficult too. You have to keep treatments up each year to in those cases. But there's lots of other ways. I mean, even digging in woodlands, like with restoration plantings, even you get anytime you disturb the soil, largely by digging in a natural area, you run the risk of invasive plants. For that reason, we don't allow digging. We don't really hand dig invasive species in the city of Alexandria. We haven't for decades because of this, for this exact reason. Also, that we doing so can damage in the forest, can damage existing native wildlife. So vegetation. So we don't do that. And you can see the frame to the left is actually a botanical preserve, and doing another big stream project, and invasive species followed that project almost 100%, and the footprint of the project is just all invasives at that point. Next frame, please. Invasive plants can disrupt ecosystems by reducing biodiversity at multiple trophic levels. That's different on the food chain, and also at multiple strata levels. So this slide really speaks to the multiple strata levels, but in cases like we're finding in lots of, for instance, like with bush honeysuckle, the arthropod abundance and diversity, as this Natural Areas Journal article here in the footnote suggests, that that invasive monocultures, near monocultures of invasive exotic plants can also fuel and give rise to near very low levels of native fauna as well, because the complex interrelationships between the plants and animals is now destroyed and broken, and a new regime, artificial regime, comes into play. And in the case of the Lonicera macii, the bush honeysuckle, you get great infestations of ticks. And we've seen that with the common barberry, the Japanese barberry, and many other species. So certainly the strata levels, we've all seen this kind of a ghastly example. This is Dangerfield Island, the city of Alexandria. One of the biggest problems we have up in the DC area are the invasive vines. In fact, the friends in Virginia Natural Heritage colloquially call this the DC, the vine forest of DC, and that's true. They're really on the edge, the large ones that fruit because of the sunlight, but the fruit from these infestations is carried into the woodlands by in the fall by starlings and robins and such, and they're just dropped all over the forest floor and by the millions. And you've got these little seedlings around. They won't, because of the shade in the forest interior, they won't, they readily germinate, but they won't grow, they won't flower and fruit because of the shade in the forest, but they will grow and smother existing vegetation and suppress it and eventually kill it off. So very important. This is porcelain berry Ampelopsis breva pedunculata. The other companion to this is Oriental bittersweet, the Silassus orbiculatus. And then we also have English ivy, heterohelix. The English ivy is most of the biggest problem in the Mid-Atlantic. The Irish ivy is around heterohibernica, but it's not nearly as common as the English ivy is. So we've got these vines, and there's others, but these are the two worst. And these are relatively new species on the horizon. They really weren't here before 1995. So in the last 25 years, they've exponentially grown. Huge root systems on the Ampelopsis, which is a grape in the grape family, and with those large reserves of energy in these massive roots, even at a young stage, the roots are proportionately much larger than the above ground part of the plant, and it makes it difficult to the only way to handle these plants is to apply a foliar treatment of herbicide. And usually you want to wait as long in the season as you can to apply that because you want maximum absorption into back to the roots. And usually follow-up treatments through the years are necessary, but not hopefully quite as much as that initial treatment. What they would do is cut them at the base of the trees and the shrubs, because you can't apply herbicide, obviously up that high. And then they don't pull them out of the trees, but you just let them hang there. They die, and then you treat the stuff that's waist or chest high, and go from there. Next, please. Obviously, this is a great example of an ecological dead zone. These vines, this is a nice old grove of old age upland oaks, southern red oak, white oak, black oak, others that are seriously threatened, and then smothering the canopy and suppressing the light that the oaks need, but also adding a lot of weight and keeping moisture close and lack of good air circulation around the trunks of the trees and the branches, which brings in a scores of diseases and pathogens to the oak. So it's a positive feedback system. It just keeps getting worse, and this was a diverse grove. I did see it before it was totally overrun with these invasives. This is the same two, again, porcelain berry and bittersweet. And it was a nice acidic oak hickory forest, very diverse, and most of that material is gone. There's hope that a lot of it remains in the seed bank, but it's in bad shape. So these are large scale jobs, and the only way to attend to them is we're lucky that we have a specialty contractor. Invasive plant control is really the best. They were probably the first. They're out of Nashville, Tennessee, but they're national in scope and operations. And obviously, if you're a natural lands manager and you're charged with controlling these infestations, which cover many acres, it's really a hopeless situation without a large-scale specialty contractor like IPC, and they have invasive plant control, and they have solved a lot of the challenges in addressing these issues. They make it economically feasible. They make it, there's extremely safe. The best practices are always improving those, always researching and studying those to produce the best operations and practices and product they can. They're hired by, the National Park Service uses them extensively. All the jurisdictions, and many of them in the DC area, Washington, DC area, use them. We have, in the city of Alexander, we have for the past 7 years or so, we were one of the later jurisdictions to come onto the scene, because we didn't have funding for this work before, 8 years ago. Some of the other jurisdictions, Fairfax County and Arlington County did. But the results are amazing. You can go from this picture here, an infestation like that, to back to what the woodland was. In some cases, with some less ornery species, we've actually restored to pre-settlement conditions. Now, what I mean by that is I'm not talking about pre-European settlement. I mean what these areas would look like a couple hundred years ago without the homes and the park trails and such. But these natural communities that haven't changed much, like an oak heath forest or like a mountain laurel oak forest, it was completely overrun with English ivy up to every tree, all over the ground, just like this picture here. Different species. It was very safely removed, didn't hurt any of the wildflowers, mosses, the mountain laurels, or the trees, but the ivy was just magically erased. And that was the first project that was probably, maybe like 16, 17 plus years ago, that IPC came to Arlington County and restored an entire forested ravine, large park, in this way. And so it certainly can be done. I was skeptical before then. I wasn't sure exactly how that was going to turn out, but it's worked out. And this has been a huge blessing for my work, because what I had to work with before I got large-scale funding was volunteer groups here and there going out and becoming very frustrated, just yanking vines here, cutting vines here and there, and they would grow back by the end of the growing season, if not sooner. And I really never encouraged or would send volunteers into these kinds of habitats, or these kinds of infestations anyway, because I consider it an abuse of volunteer effort and people's time, because they really aren't accomplishing anything. Now, if this was your backyard and you had 2 acres of this, sure, you could just work on it. One could work on it just bit by bit, but that's not the way these things are. And we've got just so many examples of like this all around the region, at least up this way. Down south, you've got kudzu issues. That's another famous example of this kind of vine takeover. So you have these invasive species. There's not a lot of them. There's a few, let's say maybe 20, 30, that have this large scale effect on the landscape, but they're the same ones over and over again. They're the bush honeysuckle, the bamboo, privet, the porcelain berry, the oriental bittersweet, English ivy, kudzu, Phragmites in wetlands is a good one, and the microstegium, the Feminium, the Japanese stiltgrass, the wavy leaf basket grass, the calorie pear is a really noxious one as well. So those do all hit forested communities, and this is the eastern deciduous forest for the large part, as well as wetlands. But in the case of the forest, they do attack them infest these communities at different strata: the forest floor, the shrub layer, the understory, and then certainly the overstory when you get vines that crawl up the trunks. Next, please. This is I sampled this plot. This is also the gold mine track again, Great Falls, Maryland. This was a highly diverse wetland, skunk cabbage, seepage wetland, and had rare fauna in it, the Appalachian spring snail, in addition to many other things, and rare community as far as the vegetation community, but also with rare fauna as well. And there was no, I think it was 2001, there were no siltgrass in the plot or the vicinity, and then went back to check it out years later, and this is what the community looked like. Completely overrun, and a lot of the species, the herbaceous plants that I found in here, including some of the shrubs as well, totally disappeared. So it's pretty bad. And where you see in the backdrop, in some of these shots of the stilt grass, bare areas. The stilt grass doesn't like deep shade, like under beaches and such. So that's why those areas are bare. Next, please. We did a couple years ago, many years in the making, is the first ever City of Alexandria Natural Resource Management Plan. And we wanted it to be a living document, a meaningful document, not just some ream of paper that sits on a shelf that doesn't know, and it's too boring and too obtuse for folks to even want to look at. And also a lot of, language doesn't go anywhere, like, to the best extent possible, consider this, consider that. That really isn't worth much. We want it to be something, a real action plan with realistic, doable practices and such. And the overarching goals are no net loss of city-owned lands. That's what's in our jurisdiction, our domain. We hope for no net loss of other lands as well, but that's really not up to us. That's certainly not up to the Parks Department. And do no harm. These are living systems, just like the medical profession. Same overarching precept. It's biology. You don't want to. It's do no harm. Certainly you don't want to be causing intentional or unintentional damage to anything that we're supposed to steward. Those are the driving factors. And invasive species control is a big part of that, obviously, because it is a net loss of natural lands, and also it's a huge net loss of native biodiversity, which already has enough stressors with climate change and loss of habitat, fragmentation of habitat, freak weather events, which are part of climate change, all sorts of things. But it's a sure way to lose pretty much everything if it's not addressed or tended to. And there isn't a staff anywhere that can really attend to these issues. If it's just left up to staff alone. Next, please. So here is the IPC folks in action here, invasive plant control. The frame at the bottom left this is a complete monoculture of calorie pear. Bradford pear is another common word for the collection of cultivars of Pyrus Caloriana, which the epicenter for that in the nation was up here in Beltsville, Maryland. USDA experimented with a lot of different kinds of calorie pair and released them. They were supposed to be self-infertile, which is fine as if you're just dealing with self, but they made the colossal genetic mistake that Jurassic Park, the movie, so nicely showed, which was you can't put, when you put two self-infertile things together, or a bunch of them, hundreds of them together, just remove the word self and they're all fertile, and they back cross, and then you get the ancestral Pyrus caloriana, and that thing is hard to get rid of. This was sort of a hopeless kind of situation, but they again, IPC came in and did a great job. It for a lot less, very economically competitive, a lot less than one would think, imagine. And that community is that habitat has been restored. It's a natural meadow. There was no calorie pair there in the 90s, but because there were a few older specimens planted, a few thousand feet away, the birds dropped them all over the meadows over the years, and then they flourished. So when I mean large scale funding, it's 6 figures. I've been fortunate to have $100,000 to sometimes 160 occasionally a year, and that's with the backing of my department heads, also the backing of the elected officials in the city of Alexandria, which is not an accident. Didn't require a lot of lobbying, just adherence to good science, to best practices, of which we've researched, and we write our own, and we instruct regionally on those, and also nationally at some of these large scale conferences. Some of the results, the positive results, were listed among the city's top 10 environmental accomplishments, which is nice. Going from 0 to somewhere high is a good thing, but it all comes from the funding. And in our case, we had a deputy director who had a familiarity with this issue, coming from other jurisdictions in Virginia, including Roanoke, City of Roanoke, City of Richmond, and Arlington County. And so we didn't lose any ground. When he joined our workforce, he's since retired. He sympathetic to this issue, understood the importance, and he diverted some funding to it, and not as a trial program, but it was more successful than we would have imagined. It really made the difference. The bottom photo on the bottom right is emerald ash borer. That's a huge issue. Those our urban forestry division treats the older and champion, but notable and champion older ash trees in the city with emamectin benzoate to preserve those trees. We've got a lot of seedlings around because, like the American chestnut, the borer does not go after the young trees and young saplings under, let's say, certainly not under 10 centimeters DBH, but That's diameter at breast height, but about 15 centimeters DBH is the size that the EAV emerald ash borer really starts targeting. So those are two large-scale invasive species control programs we have. Next, please. And you can see the photo on the left is the post cleanup. That whole meadowy area there was 100% calorie pear with porcelain berry and a bunch of other junk underneath it, the pear. But you couldn't see anything in there. It was just solid the pear. And then all the brush was dragged to the corner of to the edge of Duke Street there. And the image on the right is a beautiful stand of purple top grass, native grass, and wildflowers in the background in that same exact spot. There's no evidence the pear was ever there. And the trees that you see in the background along the highway interchange there are the native trees that were encroached upon by the pear. So that's why they're sort of thin and spindly, because they had these infestations of calorie pear right up in their drip lines, and they were sort of killing off sections of the tree. But they're all coming back, and this is purely a result of large-scale work and appropriate funding to accomplish that. And so the public support of this is manyfold. The public, and most of the public is pretty savvy about these things ecologically. Certainly the master gardeners have a great sense of the importance of this. But some folks who don't have much of a connection to nature or to vegetation and such, they may not intuitively know this. But once you provide a rational argument for it, they understand it immediately, and they're 100% behind you. For instance, in this case, this is 5 acres, this whole meadow complex here. And folks had seen just calorie pear infestations there for years. We really weren't able to get in there and do much other than just chop some of them down. And so they thought that these were just nice trees, and they didn't understand that they were invasive or highly invasive and noxious even. And that they thought they were helping to offset climate change and to help improve air quality and the aesthetics of the interchange and such. And the argument one of the arguments, of course, that we use in these cases is that it is an ecological dead zone, that all the associated wildlife, there are no meadow birds, there's no meadow wildlife here, the plants and animals. It's just a dead zone. It's like a fake, it's like astroturf really, except it's worse because it's spreading out into other areas like a cancer cell. It's not static like plastic plants are, but it has the same dead zone values to the ecological values. There aren't any. And even the berries aren't even good for the fruits aren't even good for the wildlife. Most of what eats them are the invasive birds. So with some education, folks get behind it, but there was initial outcry here and there, not universal, but some that went to the mayor and to city council. We had to respond to that, which we do. We've got, now it's just cut and paste form letters. And we defend our work, and they're on board. And we do need to maintain a budget of at least $100,000 a year. The other thing to note about that is, you don't expend, obviously, that, the initial cost is much greater than the follow-up cost, which is how you'd expect it and how you'd want it. Otherwise, there'd be a big problem with the program. So we can only tackle a few large-scale projects with that any given budget year, additional ones. But we also carry all of the previously treated sites in the follow-up treatment, but they may only be like 2 hours of time versus 3 days of work full time. So with a crew, so you never really you're never done, but your follow-up work treatment should get down to very, very low, maybe like a fraction of what the original treatment was. Certainly nothing like this frame in the left here, where you have chainsaws and removing large amounts of material. Everything will be small and in the seedling stage, which is where these days where your volunteer efforts should be directed, in my opinion. If you go into any interior forest in Northern Virginia, you're going to find just scores of the fruits of these invasives all over the fertile organic horizon of the forest floor, the leaf and litter and woodland duff layer, which is sort of as a nurse. It's a nursery for native plants, but also for the invasives as well. And recognizing these small seedlings and saplings, and they pull very easily, and then removing them is where you want your volunteers. It's great for kids and for older people who can't can't be yanking vines for their health's sake and such, doing any large any heavy lifting or anything like that. So it's a great opportunity to direct volunteer efforts, and it's much needed because you don't use chemicals on those plants. The chemicals are ineffective against the seedlings for the most part, and they're intermixed with native plants, and it's not really a chemical treatment option. Next, please. This is a combination of just a horrible, atrocious site. This is it was a beautiful tidal hardwood swamp once upon a time on the Potomac River. It joins a freshwater tidal marsh, and we've got 3 noxious weeds here in the picture. There's most of it's porcelain berry, banks of it's growing on top of Phragmites, the common reed. You can see it in flower there, and hang on to the right front side of the picture, but also the flowers throughout the picture. And then that willow is crack willow, Salix X fragilis, and I sent a handout for this presentation. It's a noteworthy collections in the Journal of the Southern Appalachian Botanical Society, Castanea, on this species, and it's a bad weed in North America. So these are, this image like this just begs large-scale factory-type industrial strength invasive control treatment program, not volunteers and not whatever staff is on hand, and not mechanical removal. That's the other thing, that just it's like mowing the lawn. It'll grow again, and quickly. And you really need to try to get rid of it once and for all, and then go into follow-up treatment. So you want to knock it out. And usually what we find in these situations is that 85% of this of what you see in this image here will be knocked out in the first treatment, and then you're always going to have follow-up. Some of this stuff you can't even is there's so many layers of leaf material here that some of the stuff is actually protected by other invasives on top of it. So it takes a couple rounds to deal with these kinds of really bad issues. But we're really lucky that we have a company like IPC to do this kind of work, because I don't think, normally there weren't a lot of companies clamoring to get involved in this kind of work. They were just sort of abandoned and let go as just dead zones, and let's move inwards and guard the best of what we have that's left. The first few years in the city of Alexandria, we did just that. We were stewarding and taking care of the best sites first. When we got IPC on board, we still took care, we prioritized the best and the last sites we had first. And then when we got those taken care of or under control satisfactorily, then we moved outwards to these sites like we're seeing here. Next, please. This is a kudzu infestation in a nice acidic oak hickory forest. And you can see all those vines all the way to the tops of the trees and over the trees. So it looked like a gigantic, it was over, just these rounded masses of vines over the canopy, the overstory, which is really quite a sight. Most of us have seen kudzu infestation, certainly southward, where they really are especially bad. And this has persisted for a long time. This plant also has huge root reserves, gigantic leaves, and you want to wait until, if you wait until October to attack this plant with a foliar treatment, the maximum amount of material, herbicide, moves back into, is translocated to the roots, and you get the best results. The earlier in the season you treat these, the energy is really not being, the plant is really going outward. It's not bringing nutrients inward so much. So this is a job that was only possible with IPC, and there are other companies out there. I consider for my work, I consider IPC a sole source vendor, because I've used a couple others before them, but it was a different kind of, they were not set up in the same way as IPC, and which is really a leader in the industry. They're the industry best is how I refer to them. Next, please. This is what we have along our highly disturbed, some of our larger streams in Alexandria. These infestations of continuous infestations of porcelainberry, tree of heaven, Callery pear, English ivy, oriental bittersweet, bush honeysuckle, mimosa, many others. We've got the mile-a-minute vine in there, lesser celandine in some places. And all of this, none of this was here, maybe a few mimosa trees, but none of those species, well, except for an English ivy, were in this area, but sparingly. In the early 70s, when this channel was created, this artificial channel, and it was rip-wrapped, the Army Corps of Engineers created this to alleviate flooding issues in the lower Holmes Run watershed. And so you've got a perfect vector for disturbance vector, a natural one in the case of a stream, a large order stream with flood scouring. But when you disturb the soils and you put in artificial armament, like gabion, that's the stone in the chain link fence, or blocks of that in the stack, or the boulders, and that's riprap. We've got these large cracks. The weeds get deposited in the cracks of the boulders because they're just dry sacked there. They're piles of them. And they grow, and there's no way you can get to the roots. You can't even if you wanted to dig them out, you couldn't. It's way too big of an operation to even think about digging. But even if you wanted to do that, you can't have volunteers working in there even if you wanted to do that, because you can't even see what's underfoot. It's dangerous. And so these areas were completely abandoned until a couple of years ago, when we finally decided we were able to tackle some of these large corridors. So this is an example of limiting disturbance, and virtually every stream restoration project, I don't call it restoration, I call them construction projects, because they are construction projects, pure and simple. Is complete soil disturbance and contouring the streams and whatnot. And so you have invasive species just completely exploit that environment, those conditions, and remain there. And there is never any, in those projects, there's never any follow-up funding or work for removal of invasive species. And you know, it's really, it's not appropriate to dump those projects into the existing ones that a jurisdiction is struggling to keep up with or deal with, because they're quite large, and they require significant more funding that may not be available. That usually is not available. So this is an example of what this before image, and then the next shot, please, is just immediately afterwards, and you can see the vines and the trees. That's a healthy sycamore there in the bottom right. Where you actually see the stream bank. You can see the edges of it. You have the invasives growing actually out into the water. Here you've got some nice sand bars and gravel bars on the edges, and what we found here was that we really couldn't see it because the vines had grown up on the top. The dead trees on the left are tree of heaven, Ailanthus altissima. And that left side had a complete understory of Callery pear and bush honeysuckle. It was just complete. The right side, a lot as well. But what we found, especially on the right side, which is more natural, if you would imagine, were a lot of really nice native hardwoods: bitternut hickory, sycamore, tulip tree, American elm, lots of good trees in there. Some of the oaks, pin oak, and so we actually have what looks like a natural stream channel emerging, and it's follow-up treatment for sure. This will be our third year of treatment here, and it's really restoring nicely. Next slide, please. This is a little closer view of some of these awful things: porcelainberry, milo-minute, vine, tree of heaven. That's all on the left side there. The right side is more disturbed, or there is more the lower material, Callery pear and bush honeysuckle. And the next image, please. We've got sort of a post immediately, maybe couple weeks after, 3 weeks maybe in the summertime after the original treatment. These were done like in late August and September, because we wanted to, it doesn't work to do them even this time of year is a little too early, but it's effective. I mean, I'm not saying you can get the original treatments in, but you'll really have some effect later, as late as you can wait. Now, for things like the mimosas, we wanted to get those before they produce seed. and so those can be done anytime because they're you're not foliar treating those. Those are those are girdled, and the chemical is applied to the edge. For instance, like Tree of Heaven, you don't want to cut them down because it just sends out root sprouts. You want to girdle it and treat it that way, and that's the most effective way to treat Tree of Heaven. Next, please. This is really a god-awful mess here. This is our partners with the National Park Service who are in here. This is the way we were doing it back in 2009, and then again in 2014 we were treating the Phragmites. In this case, we've got an aquatic safe glyphosate product, which is called Rodeo. That's pretty much the industry standard, and we use a soy-based surfactant with a blue dye, so you can see where you've applied the chemical, and to treat this Phragmites, which is like 12 to 15 to 18, maybe 20 feet tall throughout here. Next, please. And this is the follow-up. This is the final, a couple of years ago. This is 2018 photo of that same site. It's an ancient freshwater tidal channel that meanders along the edge of an industrial area, the famous Potomac Yard area, which was 550 acres of railroad tracks and industrial footprint there. And that's where the Phragmites came from, and loves those kinds of communities. And it came in probably with gravel for like railroad beds. Why you see it a lot of times growing in wetlands around mines, rock mines where they crush it up into aggregate for railroad tracks and such, construction sites and whatever. The grassy, these are cattails and bulrush in the photo here. There is some Phragmites. Phragmites is a tough one to get rid of because it's got such a strong root system. Want to wait into October, early October to get these guys as well. But it's effective. It's IPC the Park Service really took care of their part of this. They jointly own this property with the city of Alexandria, so they had done a good job getting rid of it. Actually, they used their staff for this site. They purchased some equipment, this spray tank that was really high end, and they could really target their issues with this. We used IPC to work on the interior sites, and so this fall we'll do some follow-up treatment here, but it's greatly improved. Now you can see in the far right of this shot, we do have the same awful mess of porcelain berry and English ivy mainly. They're just crippling the forest there, bringing down a lot of trees. A lot of complaints from the neighbors who live up on the river terrace above the right corner of the frame of the slide there. And that's really next on our list of a large scale area that we really need to reclaim or try to clean up. Mosquitoes are worse. The Asian tiger mosquitoes are much worse in these kinds of vine forests. And there's another example of the different trophic levels of disrupting the native ecosystem through invasive species. So this is one we'll like to get to, and hopefully we have get citizens to advocate and lobby at the state level, but also with the elected officials in whatever jurisdiction they reside in to establish funding or to continue the funding at the level or increase it throughout. Because these aren't just regional problems, they're statewide, and they need to be attended to. And I know that some of the rural counties and rural areas of the state, there's a lot more of that than there are the urbanized ones. They don't have anywhere near the funding that we do up in the DC area, or folks in the Richmond area might have, or Norfolk area, to attend to these matters. That's why I wish that we could work with EPA to get stormwater credits for removal of invasive species in these watersheds, because we're spending, hundreds of millions of dollars, comparable amount of money to do the restoration and construction projects, which are highly destructive and destroy native wildlife and the land itself. We'd love to get credits for our efforts to improve the watershed by restoring it to a more natural condition through the removal of invasive plants, and which contribute to a significant amount, some of them to nutrient loading. For instance, microspecium, and all that material, all the leaf material dies and just dropped into the stream. That's a nice, it's a pretty significant quantities of nitrogen that's dumped into the bay each year that wasn't there normally. So that's really crucial that we get public support for these programs, large and small, and try to lobby the state to recognize them as well. The state really doesn't deal with this. Really, it's done at a local level, but we need to sort of connect the dots, and public support is crucial to that. I think that takes us to the questions part, if there are any.
Great, thank you very much, Ron. We have had some questions in, and as we start going through these, please feel free to type them if you have any other questions into the Q&A. So I'm just going to go right down the line, if that works for you, Rod.
Absolutely.
Do you know if anything is being done to stop plant nurseries from selling invasive species?
Well, it's a good question. A number of things have been done to try and steer that process. And some of, for instance, the Virginia Native Plant Society, and I'm sure they had some partners that signed on to that years ago, came real close to getting the state legislature to ban the sale of English ivy. And of course it failed miserably in the once it hit the floor, because it's protected under it's business commerce. So the nursery lobby and the landscapers lobby got together, and they overwhelmed it. They just blew it out of the water, so that it failed. And I think most ones like that will fail, even stuff like calorie pear and whatever. In Virginia, I don't think it fares much better in Maryland. Maryland, a similar situation, like in Montgomery County, one can't apply fertilizers and lawn chemicals, including pesticides, on your property, or for the sake of beautification. But you can do it for removal of invasive species, whatever. So that's a similar example. that where Maryland was successful in knocking back the for good reason some of the damaging effects of the landscape and nursery industry. So I know some folks up here were so the native plant societies made little cards that they would drop off with the nurseries and saying, you know, like, don't sell, please don't sell this. Here's a native, here's what you should be using. This is what this plant, like, you know, porcelain berry. And a lot of the nurseries, just like in the grocery industry or whatever, they know there's a good market up in some of these these urban areas. There's a good market for alternative products. So they're wise to not sell things that like porcelain berry anymore. Or bittersweet. You used to be able to get that 10 years ago. I don't think nurseries up here sell it anymore. I know they sell English ivy, they sell periwinkle, they sell those things. In the case of purple loosestrife, that is considered a noxious weed in Virginia, so it technically is illegal to possess it or to grow it or to buy it, even though you see some folks with it in their gardens, but not too much anymore. So that was, for some reason, that was a successful campaign. The nurseries did sell that. I don't know why that worked. And others, English ivy didn't. I know they have a much worse problem with purple loosestrife up in Michigan, well north of here, and in New England, but not so much here. Most of what's on the Virginia noxious weed list are the agricultural weeds that folks are not going to be buying and growing.
Great, thanks. The next question we have. Someone had non-native invasives in a plant container and dumped the entire contents of that container into a black plastic trash bag and then set that bag in the hot sun. Is this enough to kill the invasives? And then how do you dispose of those to keep them from spreading, like in a landfill or something like that? That's
a really good question, and that's one I'm dealing with now, because I've got a bunch of weeds with the COVID crisis, COVID-19 crisis this spring. I was able to actually get out and do something productive instead of just information, shifting information around and reports and environmental review. So I went out and I hand pulled a lot of mature garlic mustard and a lot of buttercups and things like that, and put them in plastic bags. It's still down in the back of my truck because I wasn't sure what to do with them. I didn't want to put them in the leaf mold, the county, which is you never want to use that the municipal leaf mold for anything except vegetable gardens, where you're going to constantly be turning the soil and monitoring the soil. You never want to use it in natural areas for that reason, because it's everything that's vacuumed up on the street, the trash, the litter, the plastics, and the seeds, weed seeds, all ground up, and then you get it. The heat will not successfully kill everything, for sure. Like dock, I mean, I don't think that, and some like Canada thistle and such, there's just a lot of weeds that get spread that way. Some the heat will seriously damage some weeds, seeds, but others seem to come out okay. I hate throwing those things in the plastics with green material in the landfill, although they do cover the landfill with soil anyway, and then it's sort of capped. So that's probably not the worst thing in the world. We have an incinerator in the city of Alexandria that produces electricity. So, that's not a bad place for these things to go, to be incinerated, putting carbon up into the atmosphere, sure. Rather than just sequestering them somewhere. I guess they could also have like a, create some kind of on a concrete pad or in an old dumpster or something like that, just a compost heap for these things. And just, that's an idea that may not be for the homeowner, but might be for a co-op or a collection of folks, if they have space to make some kind of a long-term place to compost these things to where nothing can escape seed-wise.
The next question we have is, what happens after you chemically treat and kill the invasives? Do you then come back and mechanically or manually remove the dead plant material?
That's a really good question too, and it brings up a point I wanted to make. So thank you for that. Well, yes, for instance, like if we girdle the tree of heaven and it dies, stands up, eventually sometimes a few years later it'll fall down. And if it's in an area that's like a lot of these places are, that's along a park or area that's a public hazard, then yes, we do. Our urban forestry operations will direct the tree crew to come in there. They will cut it out. They'll wood chip it, and then remove it. So that's from a hazard point of view. As far as generally we leave dead wood standing as a habitat, and so we try to do that as much as possible. And if it's not going to hurt anyone, then we leave it. All the woody shrubby materials like bush honeysuckle, those are cut to the floor. Those are chainsawed to the floor, and then in seconds, as you probably all know, you have to treat you apply to the fresh cut within like seconds, because very soon after, if you let even like a minute, the plant will just put a moisture seal over it, and the herbicide will not be absorbed into the roots. So you have a short window of time there. So that's what we do. We leave that stuff to rot, and we leave that in place, and it decays pretty quickly. So we certainly don't want to do any mechanical soil disturbance. And then part two of that is the question I usually get from folks is, do you replant with natives? And first of all, natives are obviously relative. They're local and natural. They're not, in a catalog. They're not in Nova Natives or the Chesapeake Bay Scapes or anything like that. Those are natives that are not native locally to every place. So you always want to use the common successional plants to restore. But in a post-invasive removal project, no, you don't plant anything. You let the seed bank regenerate, and you let what's there naturally regrow, and it does. And you don't enhance it, or it's not like clearing a place for a garden. So.
You've mentioned the word girdling and using that as a term in your process of removing invasives. Could you just go through that a little bit for anyone who might not know what that process involves?
Sure. Well, when a beaver removes a tree, basically chews into it around the circumference of the trunk, and basically breaks the vascular system of the tree. Remember that the interior of a tree is dead wood naturally. It's not diseased, which is why most older trees, especially the oaks, tulip tree, beech, they're all hollow inside, or have the heartwood is dead wood. It's the living part of the tree is the outer xylem and phloem, where the water and nutrients are transported. In fact, it's like an elevator from the roots to the top, and that's the way it works. When you disrupt that you kill the tree off, some trees will resprout with girdling from the base, but a lot of species will not resprout. And so when like for tree of heaven, they'll just take the chainsaw, and it'll be a thin cut, like a wire cut around the trunk, and then they immediately apply the herbicide right to that cut. And and that seems to work for ailanthus. You don't need to make a big cut or a girdle. The girdling can also be interior, like in the case of the chestnut blight, that pathogen effectively girdles the tree from within, and then when you see the canker sort of blistering out on the trunk, that's the sign of the area where the girdling has been going on. And so that tree, upper part of the tree dies, and what you have is lots of root sprouts coming up for time. So that's girdling.
Great, thanks. Is there a best time to girdle trees during the year? Let's say a tree of heaven.
Yeah, you want to wait. I mean, preferably before they fruit, they flower and then they drop fruit all over the place. But so not before. I would say probably not before May. But if it's a mature tree, I think any time is okay. I do think that you have a better chance as you advance into the growing season, to where the tree is slowly starting to take more to the roots, more energy to the roots.
Great.
So maybe July, August is a good time to start. But June is probably good too.
Great, thanks. This question is, in the Homes Run example, how did you manage to kill the invasives but not the natives, such as the sycamore and other hardwoods that are underneath all of the vines? And how did you kill the mimosa tree?
Good questions. The vines were, remember when they're growing up into the canopy or up above, let's say your chest height, we don't spray in the air, or we don't have helicopters or anything like that, or we don't do it from a cherry picker. So you have to manually, labor intensive. You have to cut those vines at the bottom, and that's why they were just swinging dead there, in the ones from the canopy. And then so what you have is everything on the forest floor that's giving rise to those vines. So the upper part of the vines are gone. There's going to be no fruit. There's no flowers. Those are gone. And so you don't really touch the tree. And then you treat the stuff on the floor, and it's just for like chest height down. And anything that's taller than that, you have to cut out by hand, and then deal with everything on the floor. In case of English ivy, the same thing, except English ivy grips against winter creeper. Euonymus fortunei, they grip and dig into the bark of the trees. So you have to cut those vines off carefully so you don't hurt the tree trunks and hurt the bark. And then you cut them right at the ground, and then you treat that large vine, the stem of the vine that you've cut. You treat that, and then you treat everything on the floor. And you don't, like an English ivy, you don't just pull it off because you rip pieces of bark off if you do that. So you just let it die on the trunk, and it'll slough off in a season.
And any advice about mimosa trees?
Oh, mimosa, thank you. Yes, just basically those. They just cut those down, and they were IPC was girdling those as well. Because I think I think that might be the protocol, but I think you could also just cut them off the floor and at the ground level, and then just treat them, treat them like you would calorie pair. Yeah.
Sure. All right. Once you've treated and killed Phragmites, will it come back if you don't disturb that site again? You do have to do follow-up treatments for that. That is a tenacious beast. That thing will come back, but in isolated, scattered occurrences, it won't be uniform, continuous colonies like it once was. That's a good question. Is being near an industrial area,
because most of where you find Phragmites is in these industrial areas, and which can include docks and waterways, with a lot of boat traffic and such. So usually no, it won't, because these things were got established when they put a bridge in, or they imported something in, like the gravel or soil or whatever. So usually they won't. There's really not, once you get rid of the source of the material, there's usually not. They're not going to blow in from nearby anywhere. There's really no way it'll come back in there, because they were sort of like it's almost like like injected into the landscape. They they didn't just blow in, or seed in like calorie pear might. Calorie pear came in because somebody planted a tree, and that tree, it was spread from that plant.
All right, thank you. Could you describe some of your most effective messaging to reach the public for their support and educate them about invasives on their own properties?
Those are good. Ecological dead zone is a great term to use. The fact that that you've lost real estate. So if you've got 100 acres in your park system, or in your city or your town or your neighborhood, and 25 acres are compromised, you don't have, you just have land that's totally unusable, that's totally worthless. It's a public health hazard. For instance, like stands of bamboo are great vectors for disease, because it's an unnatural habitat. They're really dense, and starlings and other invasive birds will go in and use those areas. They're dry landscapes, so you don't have a lot of rain, moisture flushing them out. So you have the bird droppings become, like breathing pollen, and they become atomized. And if anyone's near there or walking in there, you get a histoplasmosis, which can be a deadly issue for people, and I'm sure other mammals as well. So that's just one example of why these why the public should care, and good sort of boilerplate ideas to help convince folks that these things really are the absolute opposite of sustainable, functioning, biodiverse habitats, healthy habitats. They're completely unhealthy. They're feeding, they're destroying native wildlife. We're losing species of insects, the foundation of the ecosystem. Anywhere we're losing bird species right and left that depend on a functioning system, because the insects are gone, but also other reasons. They're eating junk food. These monocultures, these dead zones, like bush honeysuckle. That's like eating Pop-Tarts for and feeding your kids that. It's just basically it's causing massive disruptions. The quality of the eggs and the offspring of the bird species is the weight, and there's no nutrition, and because these our native wildlife did not co-evolve with these invasive species, and so all those are really important. I think ways, and very intuitive to folks. They pick up on it right off the bat, I think.
Great. Along that same lines, we had another question about recommendations for working with homeowners associations to help remove invasives from private property. And along that same line, are there any resources that you would encourage people to go out and look for, either for their own education so they can help educate people, or to help partner with?
That's a good one. Another handout I presented was the City of Alexandria, the non-native invasive plants in the City of Alexandria. That really is for all of Northern Virginia. In fact, the state, Virginia DCR, was recommended that be used because the state list is really Richmond South. And so a lot of people have to remember that there's a whole different worlds in Virginia. Blacksburg, Virginia is a different world than Richmond, and certainly different from Northern Virginia. And got different issues, some of the same, a lot of the same, but totally different issues that are there, and different attitudes to some of these things. So the challenge of producing a state list is trying to capture that throughout the state. And we found that a lot of stuff that was, for instance, calorie repair wasn't even on the state list, 10 years ago, and it's a huge problem everywhere. That it was it's tough to it's a rangy state and to deal with all the issues. So, and also a lot of the plants that are new on the horizon are on the Alexander list. So I would use that with a homeowners association, because you inevitably you get the, well, what's wrong with calorie repair? Oh, it's not a problem down here. It's more of a problem in the DC area because of the USDA. Plants escaped, and we're okay for a while here. So you get that a lot in homeowners associations, and homeowners associations have hire landscaping companies to oversee the grounds, and that's just the traditional old-fashioned way of doing business, and it's high on chemicals, and it's sort of a rough and ready coarse filter kind of approach. And I think that the boards of these HOAs need to, because they have complete control over the landscaping programs, need to keep current in these best practices, and help and guide and inform that, because you don't want folks going out there and spraying for mosquitoes all over the place. You don't want people just killing off all the soil microorganisms because they're just slathering pesticides unnecessarily into the lawns. You don't want them. I've known a number of these folks that landscaping, when they want to remove vines from a tree, they'll take a chainsaw and they just cut into the trees, trying to remove like English ivy and stuff. So, and they don't attend to the invasive species, but that's not their charge. So you can try to educate them, but that's going to come from the board. And as far as information, there's best practices out there. You can Google the Invasive Plant Control website and join in on some of their conferences. They have some of these things that they're from their presentations from different folks on their websites, their website there, and inviting, like the extension agents generally are not up on this exactly. It's again, you want to go in the direction of do no harm, keep it natural. That's where you're going to get your best sense of things, rather than, gee, we have a chemical at the garden center that'll take care of that perfectly for you kind of approach. And there's, I guess, a long answer to a not simple question, but there isn't really any web page or any one place that you're going to get all the best practices on this. It's definitely soil, not producing soil disturbance is one of them. Careful use of herbicides is another one. Seasonality and those sorts of things. You could always give IPC a call and talk to one of the folks there. They're friendly and they might very well send somebody out to give a presentation to a homeowners association. They do that a lot, quite a lot actually, and that's part of their job.
We've had a couple questions about what specific herbicides were used to kill invasives in the pictures that you showed in your presentation. And then specifically, there were additional questions about cut ivy vines and what herbicide to use with those, as well as Japanese stiltgrass. So kind of a multi-part question of maybe there are resources that people can find of if they have invasives in their yard, where can they find what herbicide should be used to treat that effectively?
Yeah, it's very good. We don't use Monsanto's Roundup, and we haven't for ages. And IPC certainly doesn't, and it's not a best industry practice. Because the surfactant in Roundup, in Monsanto's Roundup is not all glyphosate. People use the word Roundup and glyphosate interchangeably, like it's like all glyphosate is Roundup. It's not. It's Monsanto's glyphosate product, and it's been determined that the surfactant, which is what causes the active ingredient, the glyphosate, to adhere to the plant tissue, the leaf, because that's the only part of the plant the glyphosate affects in application. So we use a surfactantless aquatic safe product called Rodeo, which is Dow, and that is, you need to put a surfactant with added one to that. We use one called Liberate, which is soy lecithin based, which is like a horticultural oil. It basically adheres the product to the leaf. And then the blue dye, because it's hard to tell exactly where you've been in a big patch of some infestation. Glyphosate's great for a lot of things. It's particularly good on grasses of all kinds. It was really made for grasses, and a lot of grass species are really sensitive to it. So right now, last week actually, I just asked IPC to go out and attack the microstegium, which is up about knee-high in a couple of our wetlands. But this time of year, you can use less than is specified on, so let's say that they say, maybe the label might say for these perennial grasses, annual and perennial grasses use like 1.5 to 2% solution. We don't want to use that because we'll end up doing some damage when you spray microstegium in with mixed with native. So we use like a 0.5% or a 0.75% solution, and you can spray it right over top of like jack-in-the-pulpits and native sedges and native grasses and such. I don't want to do that generally, but we have no choice because the stilt grass will totally destroy all those species in time, and not that long a time either. And a little at that low percentage this time of year, you probably get away with it later too, but a low, maybe 1% in fall, probably just do the trick as well. But let's say this time of year, you're getting it while it's still fairly young, and it's just still growing, and so it might singe a couple native non-target species, but it won't kill them. And if you reduce the amount of microstegium and the extent of the infestation, you're doing two things. You're freeing the plants that are living with it, intermixed, that are smothered, but you're also reducing that seed bank, which is what you really want to do in the annuals. And you should see that it'll maintain the footprint. Once it dies off, it'll die off quickly. Next year, you'll probably have the same amount, but if you keep doing it, I think after it takes several years, you'll eventually exhaust the seed bank with microstegium. But you're also freeing up the other plants that can in turn thrive and grow there. And they'll shrug off the little bit of glyphosate that they got, and hopefully they'll flourish. On hard to control, on the waxy leaved evergreen invasives like English ivy, winter creeper, periwinkle. Periwinkle's hard to get rid of, but some of these guys, English ivy is actually pretty responsive to some of these chemicals. We do a combination of triclopyr and glyphosate with the same surfactant and the same dye. But we use lesser amounts of each in combination. And that gives us, triclopyr is really a root killer, and that gives us a little bit, a broadleaf killer. And when that gives us more of a hit on these things. We apply those only in the cool season when we would never want to treat English ivy in a forest floor in the growing season, because you're going to definitely be killing everything else that's around it with that. So you want to do that only when the forest floor is dormant, and you can just treat the target species by itself for the most part, and that's really effective. A lot of times, just like on the girdling, those are mostly that's just straight glyphosate with the surfactant on those. That works really well. That's pretty much all we use. There's not a lot of other stuff. We tried last year. I tried the grass-specific herbicide. It's fairly expensive, but it didn't really matter much. That it smells like diesel fuel when you put it down, so people are a little bit like, well, is there an oil spill in the stream, whatever. We were using that late season on microstegium, and the weird thing about that is it worked really well in some places, and then the Fairfax County, for instance, reported like it didn't do anything. And so the applicators were wondering, well, gee, did I screw something up? Did I misread something or whatever? And that also can cause like an asthmatic condition. You have to be real careful using that. So we don't use that anymore. I think the best practice is start hitting the micro now, and with a really low solution of glyphosate, and see where you go from there.
Thank you very much. So we are just a few minutes after 2, so I'm going to make that one our last question. We did have 2 questions that we didn't get to, so if you don't mind, I can just email those to you.
Absolutely.
And then you can type those up, and we can get those put into Canvas with the rest of your handouts, so no one's question gets left behind. But thank you so much for joining us. This was a really informative session, and I hope everyone found it to be very helpful in their own neck of the woods and with whatever non-native invasives they're seeing in their own backyard, including my backyard. So thank you very much, and I hope we will see everybody at 2:30 for our closing keynote session. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.